Hey guys, we keep going over reserve funding and how to do it and different ways to calculate things. We already went over what needs to go in reserves, how to do the calculations for reserves. Now we're going to talk about the specific means of accounting for what's in reserves and how you can use those funds from an expenditure standpoint. And there's two methods of doing that. You have the straight line method and the pooled method or pooled reserves. Under the straight line method, you have every single reserve component, and here just for demonstrative sake, we've got roofing, painting, paving, and literally imagine you've got buckets for each one of those items. You've got $100,000 in your roof bucket, $100,000 in your painting budget or bucket, and $100,000 in your paving bucket. All of the money that goes into those buckets, if you're using straight line reserves, have to stay in those buckets for those items unless your owners vote otherwise. It's the same voting threshold we talked about the other day, when it's a majority of owners at a meeting would have to vote to use those funds for a different purpose. So if you want to take money from the painting bucket and use it for something besides painting, you'd have to get owner approval to do that if you're using the straight line method. Now, the other method is pooled reserves. Pooled reserves, you still have the same components. Pooled reserves does not mean that you can use the reserve funds for whatever you like. You still have to have the defined components. The difference is, instead of having these discrete buckets for roofing, painting, paving, you've got one big bucket for roofing, painting, or paving with $300,000 in it. So what that means is, if you've got a $150,000 painting project, because you've got painting identified as a reserve component, you can use up to $300,000 for painting. You can use up all that money for roofing. You can use all that money for paving. What you can't do is, say you need to replace your fence, but fence isn't part of our reserve pooled bucket here. We can't use that. Now, if you've defined it as a reserve component and you're saving up for it, then by all means you can do that. But just keep in mind, these are discrete buckets. This money can only be used for these things. This is still a discrete bucket. It's just a bigger bucket with more items that you can pick from, but it's not a slush fund. It's not a means of using the money for whatever you like. And then the other rule of thumb is, when it comes to these expenditures, if there's a question of, well, we're doing some painting work, can we pull money from our painting reserve? The rule of thumb is, if whatever you're doing extends the useful life of that item by more than a year, then yes, you can use that money from the reserve account. If you're just doing regular maintenance that happens to be painting, say you're going to touch up a wall or an area or whatever else, but you're still going to have to repaint the building, you shouldn't be using money from your painting reserve for that item. That should be a routine maintenance item. Same thing with roofing. Say you're going to replace a few shingles on a roof, but it really doesn't extend the useful life of the roof. It's just a necessary repair because you've got a leak or something like that. Then that's not a reserve item. But if you're putting some kind of coating on something, or you're redoing something to the extent of where the roofing useful life was 10 years, but because we're doing X, Y, and Z, now we think it's going to be 13 years, then by all means, use your money from your reserve budget. That's what it's there for, is that's to extend the useful life. So I hope that clarifies what can kind of be a confusing concept with regard to how straight line versus pooled reserves works. And that concludes our discussion on reserve funding. Good luck to you guys. If y'all have any questions, let me know. Thanks.